Dear friends, hi. Good evening or morning or afternoon, whatever it is where you are. I welcome you, and I would like to start today's presentation, which is called The Habits of Rome. Just give me a second, I will try to start the screen sharing. Okay. Right, so it should be like that. Well, I would like to begin with saying thank you to the Prosvetitel or Enlightener Foundation based in Russia and headed by Dmitry Zimin, which had established the award for nonfiction in Russian, which was called the Enlightener Award. It began a little bit more than 10 years ago, and at the very beginning there were just very few books which the jury could choose from. But by now, the numbers are in the hundreds and the selection criteria are very strong. So basically, this award changed the whole structure of nonfiction publishing in Russia, which is a very important thing because until recently, it was lagging far behind the Western models. But right now, the situation is much, much better. The first slide of my presentation was showing the cover of my book, which is called Here Was Rome. And in 2017, it was also published in the UK, thanks to the publishing house called Skyscraper and its publisher, Carl Saba, whom I'm very grateful to. Unfortunately, I've never found this book in any of the major bookstores in London or elsewhere in the UK. You can order it online, that's not a problem, but it's not very visible, which is really not very good for me as the author, and I think not very good for the whole situation, because this is the only current historical guidebook to Rome, a guidebook which leads you through the streets of ancient Rome, showing you the city, as it were, through the filter of the buildings and things that you can see today. So my today's talk will be about several things which were important for the Romans. And one of those things was the time and how they calculated time. The calendar, universally known and almost universally used today, is a development of the Roman calendar. And basically the one which was reformed by Julius Caesar in 46 BC. And by the way, here I am showing you a coin and not any sculpture, because there is not a single sculpture of the time which we can confidently call a portrait of Julius Caesar. And please remember that anytime you see a bust or something of Julius Caesar, because there is no reliable bust which really shows you how Caesar looked. And the other form of this calendar was reformed and changed by Pope Gregory XIII in AD 1582. Before the first reform, it had been a debased lunisolar calendar with a common year of 355 days, which was one too many for the sake of the odd number, because the odd number was thought to be more auspicious than the even number. For the same reason, there were no 30-day months as in normal lunar calendars. February had 28 days, but all the other had an odd number of days, either 31 or 29. 6 of the months were named after the numbers 5 through 10, counting from March. But although there was a tradition claiming that this had once been the beginning of the year and February the end, to which its shortness and its purificatory rituals gave support, in historical times, the first month was January, named after Janus, the god of gateways, who faced both backwards and forwards, and who was named first in public prayers. So it's important to realize that January had been the first month of the year throughout the Roman times, and if it wasn't the first at some point, it was only in very, very hoary ancient times, which the Romans had no record of. The Romans themselves were quite aware of the contradiction, but they found no more convincing answer than that King Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome, a soldier and a statesman, but no intellectual, had not bothered to subdivide the bleak winter period between December and March. Other cultures in Italy marked the beginnings of months and their midpoints at full moon, and the Romans called these respectively calendae, from an ancient verb calare, because the new moon had originally been announced on that day, and Ides, from an Etruscan word meaning divide, which in the 431-day months, March, May, Quintilis, and October, fell on the 15th, and the rest on the 13th. But they also had a third market day, the nonnae, on the 7th of the 31-day month and the 5th of the rest. So basically, it was a jumble. It was very messy. And intercalation, when you had to insert a certain month or several days between the months so as to have the year of a certain length, was not ordered on scientific principles, but as political or other considerations might suggest. The widespread superstition that extra days were unlucky caused the process to be suspended during the Second Punic War, when Rome was at war with Hannibal. And the calendar raced some 4 months ahead of the sun during these several years. The solar eclipse on the 14th of March, 190 BC, was recorded on the 11th of July. So it was actually in March, in mid-March, as we calculate now, but it was recorded in mid-July. When the pontifices resumed intercalation, they overcompensated to such an extent that when in 153 BC a military emergency compelled the new chief officers of state, or consuls, to enter office at once and embark on a spring military campaign, they took over not on the 15th of March, as had been the norm since a long time, but on the 1st of January. And since that date was also the new year, it was retained for the start of the consuls' terms ever afterwards. So not just the new year now started on the 1st of January, but also all political structure, all political timetable also began on the 1st of January. In 63 BC, Caesar, who was at that point an ambitious young politician and not yet a military conqueror, was elected Pontifex Maximus, the senior priest of the Roman state. And he became responsible for intercalation, for managing the calendar. So the calendar once more ran ahead of the sun, and Caesar, after he had defeated his implacable enemies, was free in 46 BC to take decisive action. He ordered to extend the year, the last year of the confusion, as a late Roman writer calls it, to 445 days. So the last year of the old Roman system was as long as 445 days, because that was necessary to make up for the missed intercalations of previous years of wartime. From 45 BC onwards, the new calendar was to be enforced. The 4 31-day months were unchanged, but the 29-day months were extended by either 1 extra day, that was April, June, September, and November, or 2, that was January, Sextilis, and December, thus giving the year 365 days instead of 355. That was Caesar's reform, which he actually did not live to see implemented, but it was in force in Rome ever since Augustus and later emperors. The whole world lived with it for a long, long time. The Russian Orthodox Church continues to follow the Julian calendar even today, And that is why we have Christmas on January the 7th, and Easter usually on a different day than Western Christians, though not always. This is a very complex type of calculation tied to the solar and lunar calendar, and that's why it's not just this 13th day difference, but it can be different. It can even fall on the same day. In the West, however, things changed in the 16th century. In order that the equinox at the time on or about the 11th of March should once again fall on the 21st of March, the Pope Gregory XIII, depicted here, ordered that the day after the 4th of October 1582 should be not the 5th of October, but the 15th. And further slippage was to be prevented by suppressing the leap year in centennial years. That means those years that end in 2 zeros, unless exactly divisible by 400. The year 2000 was a leap year, but the year 2100, should I say 2100, will not be. It will not be a leap year. That was not the most accurate correction, but it was the most convenient, being far easier to keep track of than the alternative cycles. It also had the advantage that the year 1600 would still be a leap year, and the first suppression safely distant in 1700, so 100 years from the date of the reform. And this part of the reform is commonly known as the New Style. In England, for example, the change for the New Style only happened in the 18th century, so at a quite late date. But in Russia, only after the communists came to power in 1918. And as I have already said, the Russian Orthodox Church still keeps the old calendar. Here I'd like to slightly digress and tell a story about one of the most famous Roman time-marking devices, which had fallen into disrepair very soon after its erection, but was then restored, though not at the correct place. It was found later. So, at one point in the 1st century BC, a huge sundial was erected in Rome. Unfortunately, its exact location was later lost, though the Egyptian obelisk, which was its gnomon, the pointy thing which provides the shadow, was later re-erected in Piazza Montecitorio, where it still stands in front of the Italian Parliament building. Here it is. It's the old Egyptian obelisk in Piazza Montecitorio. In the 1970s, the German archaeologist Edmund Buchner had an idea. Knowing the original placement of the Augustan obelisk and the laws of planetary motion, it would be possible, he reasoned, to figure out the position of the tile that marked the months and the zodiacal signs. Knowing the positions, it would be possible to try to dig for them. The problem with any excavation in the field of Mars is the density of the urban tissue. There are lots of houses and lots of other buildings and sculptures and fountains and everything, and it's virtually impossible to dig anywhere to conduct archaeological digs. Buchner, however, managed to receive permission to explore a basement of a house in Via del Campo Marzio, and to his immense joy, at a depth of 6 meters, where the gnomon-like obelisk was supposed, according to his calculations, to point at the zodiacal sign of Virgo, he found a travertine floor and the bronze letter A. Why A? Because that was the letter in the Greek word Parthenos, which meant virgin, so it was actually pointing at a very zodiacal sign. And on the day of the emperor's birth, of the birth of Augustus, the shadow of the obelisk indicated the century. Today, there is a cafe at this point. As its sign proudly says, it's been there since 1870. And apparently you can ask the owners to have a look at the dial of the Augustan obelisk in the basement. I'm not sure that's a possible thing to do. Likewise, there is, for example, a residential home in central Rome, which is supposed to have a small Augustan time altar, which I never saw. because, you know, it's just a door into a block of flats and you can't just enter. On the other hand, there is, for example, a restaurant near the statue with ancient Roman walls on the lower levels, and that's perfectly visible when you dine there. So there are many various ancient things in the basement of various Roman structures, and sometimes you can see them, sometimes it's more difficult. The mausoleum itself had an interesting fate, perhaps more interesting than any other major landmark of ancient Rome. Until the 1930s, it was virtually unknown, though its location was more or less well known. The first fragmentary sculptures were rediscovered in the 16th century beneath Palazzo Chigi, and this is Palazzo Chigi here, right next to the Basilica San Lorenzo in Lucina on this photo. And they have found their way to the Villa Medici, the Vatican, the Uffizi, and the Louvre. So there were pieces of the Augustan altar all over the world. In 1903, well after it was recognized that those reliefs had belonged to the Arapaches, which was known from Augustus's own memoir, a request was sent to the Ministry of Public Education to continue the excavation. And the excavations were made possible by the generosity of this man who was called Eduardo Almaja. He gave his permission for the exploration and donated a huge sum of money for the excavations. By July, it became clear that the conditions were terribly difficult and the stability of Teatro Olympia, which was nearby, might well be compromised, so it was not possible to conduct further excavations. Half the monument had been examined. 53 fragments were recovered, and then the excavation was called to a halt. The process, however, got a new lease of life in the 1930s under Mussolini, who was extremely eager to celebrate 2000th anniversary of the birth of Augustus. It was scheduled for the 23rd of September 1937. Augustus was born in 63 BC, and quite often when we calculate anniversaries of events that had happened before Christ, before the beginning of the new calculation of years, we forget that there was no year zero, and we missed the mark. But this time, Mussolini's assistants calculated the date correctly. So it was indeed 1937. So the altar was reassembled. There was a whole long story about how it was assembled and how they managed to prevent the waters from everywhere to flood the place where it was excavated. They actually managed to put some gas which froze the ground around the excavations and stopped the water from flooding the altar. So they were able to excavate that because the waters around were frozen. And this altar was reassembled and re-erected in a new place on the bank of the Tiber and given a completely new shell made by the architect Vittorio Balleo Morpurgo. And this is how it looked until rather recently. In May 1938, when Hitler visited Rome, Mussolini was quite happy to show him the preparation work. The altar was open for the public a little bit later in the same year, 38. In 2006, a new Arapaches museum environment opened to much controversy. That was the new outer layer constructed by the famous American architect Richard Meyer, who was known and who is known for his very stark and usually very white style of structures. This is, for example, the project of a new American embassy in London. And this is the so-called Jubilee Church, the Church of God the Merciful Father in Rome, which was completed in 2003 with distinctive walls that gently curved towards the building center. So the new shell of the mausoleum of the Arapaches, of the Altar of Peace, was made like this, and it's really very wide, and it's one of the very few new buildings which was erected in the historical center of Rome. But as you can see, there is still a wall protruding from there, which was left from the previous shell, from Morpurgo's shell. And so, like it is a kind of a combination of this very new early 21st century building and the 1930s shell. And finally, for this part of the lecture, a few short words about how the ancient Romans divided day and night hours. This is the picture of the famous Russian poet of the late 19th, early 20th century, Valery Brusov. He was the master of exquisite poetic forms and a connoisseur of ancient poetry. And among other things, he translated the Aeneid into Russian. This photo of him had recently become very popular in the Russian sector of Facebook as an example of self-isolation, which is, as you can imagine, quite an important topic these days. In the year 1900, Brusov published a collection of poetry called Tertia Vigilia. Why and what did he mean? The Romans divided the period which we now indicate as a day, and by the way, there is no English word for a specific 24-hour interval. In Russian, we say sutki, and that means 24 hours. So the Romans divided the day into 12 hours a day and 4 vigils per night. That means that the length of this hour during the day and the length of a vigil during the night depended on the time of the year. It's not that huge a difference in Rome, but if you are in the north somewhere, even in Russia, and especially if you go even further north to St. Petersburg or to Finland, the length of day and night is hugely different during the winter and summer. So even in Rome, it was different during the summer months and during the winter. Brusov's book was called Tertia Vigilia, the third vigil, because this third vigil, the third period on the night, the one before the last, was considered the most difficult for a sentinel, the most difficult for the one holding a vigil. And this is a Roman warrior on a vigil. Okay, so our next topic and everything else in this lecture is about Roman food. And we start with things which were absent from Roman cuisine. So when we speak about Italian cuisine or Italian cooking, what do we imagine first? We think of noodles or pasta, right? We think of pepper and other kinds of spice. We think of tomatoes. We think of pizza and so on. Well, nothing of the kind could appear on an ancient Roman table. Horace and some other ancient authors mention a thing called lagano, which was a multi-layered pie from dough and stuffing, and perhaps it was an ancestor of today's lasagna. But unlike lasagna, it was not cooked, it was fried or baked. Italian school children were taught for a long time that noodles, pasta, were brought to Italy from China by Marco Polo himself in the 13th century. But this is most likely a legend. Italians could learn the art of pasta from the Arab conquerors who had settled in the Middle Ages in Sicily and some places in South Italy. Things are even worse if we take pizza. Its worldwide popularity is the result of American cultural expansion after the Second World War. It was taken to New York City by immigrants from Naples, but it was a purely regional dish. And until recently, well, not so recently, but still, until the mid-20th century, no one in Rome, Milan, or Florence have ever heard of pizza, actually tasted it. Tomatoes, which are now quintessential for many Italian meals and dishes, are a New World fruit, which of course could not appear on an ancient Roman table. This is equally correct for maize or corn, which was also brought from America. Polenta, a typical maize dish now, uh, did exist in Roman times, and the word itself was known in Latin. Of course, it was not made from maize flour, it was usually made from barley. So aubergines, or eggplants, as the Americans would say, hail from Southeast Asia, and again, they were unavailable to an ancient Roman cook, even though today this is one of the most popular vegetables in Italian cuisine. Oranges. Oranges came from China, and in Russian this is kind of obvious because in Russian this thing is called apelsin, which when you investigate the structure of the word is reduced to the words apple and sin, which means Chinese. The original word apelsin was Dutch. The English etymology is more convoluted. It's late Middle English from Old French orange in the phrase pomme d'orange, which was based on Arabic naranj, from Persian narang, from Sanskrit narangas, orange tree of uncertain origin. So it's a very long story. And anyway, this quintessentially Italian fruit was also unknown to ancient Romans. Things were not much better with desserts. Sugarcane did not grow, or at least was not cultivated, on the territory of the Roman Empire. Obtaining sugar from other plants, primarily from sugar beet, only became possible in the 18th century. In colder countries, sugarcane doesn't grow that well, so the Russians use beet and the Canadians, for example, use maple trees. So, no sugar. And the popular tiramisu dessert, which means lift me up, was invented as late as 1967 in the restaurant of the town of Treviso, not far from Venice. So, what did exist in Roman cuisine? Well, the so-called Mediterranean triad certainly existed. And let's look at each of the three components. Flour bread, sometimes with other cereals added, most often barley, as often happens in societies that are not rich, was the primary food of the Roman poor. In imperial times, Italy almost did not produce any bread. It was found that importing it from overseas provinces, especially from Egypt after it was conquered in 30 BC, was much, much cheaper. And bread was quite popular and it was badly needed. Juvenal once wrote that the nation, once giving power to officials and generals, now dreams about two things only: bread and circuses. This is a very popular Roman phrase, panem et circenses, bread and circuses. And almost all Romans, except senators, had a right for free bread. Each one had a ration card, not on paper, of course, but on a ceramic shard or something like that. And everyone knew where he or she was supposed to come for the portion of free grain. This is a fresco from Pompeii, and it's often described as the scene of selling the bread. But most probably, this is not selling. This is handing out the bread dough of various, and as you can see, these are probably not paupers. These are just regular citizens who have a right to their daily loaf or weekly loaf of bread. An astounding testimony of this practice is an epitaph on a burial chest of a little boy in the British Museum. If you are in London when the museum will be open, go to room G70 and you will find this funerary stone there. It says, to Gaius Sergius Alcimus, son of Gaius, who had lived 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days. He received grain on the 10th day of each month at counter 39. So can you imagine, the most important thing you could write on the tomb of a little boy was the day when he was receiving bread. That was a sign that he was a full functioning Roman citizen, even at that age. And this is the kind of a ceramic tool or billet or shard that you could use to get your portion. This is an example of carbonized bread from Pompeii, and you can see the baker's brand or seal on one of the slices of this bread. So this is not an older museum stamp. It was actually there in ancient Roman times. The Romans were very bureaucratically minded, and they liked to stamp everything they could lay their hands on. So the second part of the triad is olive oil, or generally anything that you can produce from olives. And that was the main cooking portion of the Roman cuisine. And the third important part was wine, of course. So this is the Mediterranean triad. There was no sugar, as I said, but honey was the natural sweetener. So to use the sweet things to make anything a dessert, you had to use honey. Meat, of course, was also very important. It was not that common on the diet of poor Roman citizens, but whenever there was, for example, a sacrifice, the things that were sacrificed and burned for the gods, or sacrificed to the lower gods, for example, that was only a small symbolic portion of the meat. Everything else was cooked and handed over to people attending the ceremony. So it was a chance for even the poor Romans to taste some meat. One of the sacrificial procedures was called a very ancient word, suovetuarilia, which comes from the word sus, which means a pig, ovis, which means sheep, and taurus, which means a bull. When we ask ourselves what kinds of meats the Romans ate, we find outstandingly that they did not have any real food prohibitions, so typical of ancient nations, as for example, the Jews didn't eat pork, but the Romans could eat anything. They didn't eat much beef, for example, because cows and especially bulls were mostly working animals. But it was possible, and they did eat it sometimes, and there were no prohibitions against any kind of food. The Romans also consumed meat in the form of sausages, and the sausages looked very much like this. They also ate various kinds of fowl, and they had many types of cheese, which was probably somewhat similar to some of the cheeses that we use today, though I think that mostly Romans gravitated towards the softer ricotta-like cheeses and had fewer old cheeses like the ones that are popular today in some parts of Italy and Switzerland, like Parmigiano and so on. So food was an important matter, and for that reason, it was often depicted on frescoes, mosaics, and so on. Fish, again, it was also important, and it was an important part of diet of people living by the seas or by the rivers and so on. And there were aquariums, and there was oyster production, which was started by a Roman called Sergio Sorata. So it was the first guy who invented oyster cultivation. One of the popular Roman foods, the foods which were not just in the Roman Empire, but exactly in the city of Rome, was a pike caught between the two bridges. As you know, there is an island on the Tiber right at the center of Rome, and there had been two Roman bridges linking the two sides of Rome, and the pike caught between them was considered the best. So the structure of a Roman diet was different from what we eat now, but of the foods I have listed, nothing would be very unusual or surprising on a modern table. Was there something in Roman cooking that differed a lot from our today's habits and customs? Well, first of all, Roman cuisine treated spices in a completely different way. After the age of discovery, we are not surprised to see a box with spices in a modern kitchen, right? But we have to remember that it used to cost a fortune, that it was one of the main engines behind the age of discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries and so on. Inventive cooking is almost impossible without spices, when dishes are prepared for fun, for pleasure, and not just for satiety. Romans, of course, loved to sigh for the austere grandfather's times, but they did know a thing or two about good living. So the spices which were well known to ancient Romans were garlic, poppy, anise, caraway, then fennel, mint, mustard. One of the most common spices of today, black pepper, was imported from India. And during the imperial era in Rome, it was included in the recipe of many dishes. The famous scholar Pliny the Elder said that Roman import of pepper cost many millions, and he wondered why people were spending so much money on such a useless product. In 1908, the Japanese chemist Kikunae Ikeda discovered the chemical basis of a separate fifth taste, which was different from the well-known sweet, bitter, sour, and salty. And that's the taste of high-protein products. He called it umami. This is an important component of taste of walnuts, fried meat, tomatoes, soy sauce, and certain hard cheeses. Mankind has known about this taste since time immemorial, but there was no separate word for it until the beginning of the 20th century. In modern cooking, especially in Southeast Asia, the taste of umami is concentrated using food chemistry, for example, in an additive called MSG, monosodium glutamate. But the Romans, however, used to prepare a special sauce for that, and that sauce was called garum. Garum was prepared like this. You take very small fishes, or even fish tripe, innards, blood, scales, and you leave it to ferment in the sun, and then you strain it. You get a liquid of very intense smell and taste, which can be added to many dishes. There was another version of this sauce, which is called liquamen, and it was obtained when you ferment whole fish, like the modern Eastern fish sauce. There is a Thai sauce called nam pla, or the Vietnamese sauce, which is called more or less nuoc mam pha. I'm sorry, I'm not sure that's the right Vietnamese pronunciation. But it's very big in the cuisines of the Far East. A friend of mine once told me a story how he was traveling back from Vietnam, and he wanted to take a bottle or a couple of bottles of this fish sauce to Russia with him. But at the check-in counter, the airline official said, no, you can't take that with you. You have to leave it here. And he says, why? But it's very well packed. It won't spill or anything. And he said, well, you know, you break one bottle and have to replace the aircraft. So this is the story, and probably you would be better advised not to take such sauces out of their actual places. But you can buy them in most Oriental shops in the US or in England or in Russia these days. Another important and unfortunately absolutely unattainable condiment was called lazer. It's a dried milky juice of a plant called silphium, which grew in the province of Cyrenaica on the territory of today's Libya. The Roman province consisted of Crete, the island of Crete, and Cyrenaica. And the seeds of silphium looked like a stylized heart. And the plant was so important for provincial economy that the hearts and shoots of silphium were coined in Cyrenaica. They were depicted on the coins minted in that province. The Roman passion for silphium proved to be extremely unlucky for the plant. By the time of Nero's rule, there was no more silphium in Cyrenaica, and the last shoot was reported to be sent to the emperor as a curiosity. So we don't even know what kind of plant that was. Finally, the last cooking fact that is an important source of joy for the authors of popular books and TV shows about ancient Rome, and probably for the readers and viewers. A forest rodent called a dormouse was a delicacy in Rome. Dormice were specially fattened in clay jugs and served baked in honey. The main source of knowledge about this unusual practice is the so-called Licinian law of 115 BC. The law was aimed against luxury, and it prohibited the use of dormice and imported fowl for regular Romans. So you see, it prohibited it, but we know that it was there, that it was possible. There are special types of jars which can be found in various Roman excavations, and they're called gliarium, from the Latin word glis, which means dormouse. And the dormice were supposed to be kept in such jars and fed until they were fat enough to be used for cooking. A little digression. These two republics of the former Yugoslavia are now independent countries called Croatia, this is green, and Slovenia, this is the orange one. Both were, by and large, a part of the Roman Empire. The Emperor Diocletian, for example, even built himself a large and opulent palace on the Adriatic in the town called Spalato, which is now Split, in Croatia, on the Adriatic seashore, and the palace is still there. The ruins, at least, are still there. There are cafes all around, and you can sit right inside the palace of Diocletian. So if you are very sensitive, don't look at the next picture. Dormouse eating is still popular in those countries. And by the way, it's not their only curious gastronomical habit. I'm originally a Slavicist, specializing in the languages and literatures of exactly these regions. And for that reason, in my youth, I was spending a lot of time in the former Yugoslavia. In Slovenia, I was quite amazed at some point that they loved green salad, which was mostly composed of dandelion leaves. This picture is from a special festival on the Croatian island of Hvar, where apparently they do still eat dormice. So dormice are still eaten in Slovenia and Croatia and considered quite tasty. Okay, so no more horrible things. This is about the Roman feast and the manner in which the Romans used to consume their food. So in any human culture, eating is not just the way of replenishing energy. It is also a ritual. A joint meal unites people and other friend of four markers. It places those markers with perhaps more accuracy than any other activity. And if we study how the ancient Romans ate, that would probably tell us more about their habits and civilization than the study of what they ate. Some anthropologists think that the food curriculum of different people still follows the very ancient division of people of prehistoric cultures into hunters and gatherers. The gatherers carry on their activity all the time, or at least during daylight. Their work is almost undivided sexually, and they eat up what they find all the time. In other words, they eat a little, but often. The hunters, on the other hand, work in small groups. In their society, the division of work into male and female portions is very important, and the obtaining and consumption of the food are separated in time. While the hunt continues, sometimes for several days, no one really eats. There is nothing to eat. Once it's over, everyone is feasting with gusto and for a long time, well, until they're quite fed up. In this classification, the Romans were typical hunters. Their morning and daytime meals, which is breakfast and lunch in our terms, consisted of small snacks, fruit and vegetables, bread and cheese, olives. During the daytime, no one really needed to work. During the daytime, one needed to work and not to eat, right? And they had to work often in the heat. In ancient Rome, even intellectual work was often done in the open, and anyone who tried to circumvent it was labeled a very bad word. He was called an umbrarius, a shadow person, someone who was hiding in the shadows. Overeating during the day was unadvisable. Middle class and upper class Romans ate at home. Catering was well established, but it mostly targeted lower class clients. Thanks to a well-developed system of connections between different strata of society, such as the almost official relationship between a patron and his clients, everyone could be expected to be invited to have dinner. To refuse was rude. Even worse was to accept and then fail to appear. A guest, when you came to someone's dinner, could bring a companion without asking permission. Such a companion was called a shadow. I will now quote an example from the life of Vitellius, one of the Roman emperors, by Suetonius, translated by Rolf. But his, that means Vitellius, his besetting sins were luxury and cruelty. He divided his feasts into 3, sometimes into 4 a day: breakfast, luncheon, dinner, and a drinking bout. And he was readily able to do justice to all of them through his habit of taking emetics. This is, by the way, something that was not the usual Roman habit or custom. I will return to that. Moreover, he had himself invited to each of these meals by different men on the same day, and the materials for any one of them never cost less than 400,000 sesterces. Most notorious of all was the dinner given by his brother to celebrate the emperor's arrival in Rome, at which 2,000 of the choicest fishes and 7,000 birds are said to have been served. He himself eclipsed even this at the dedication of a platter, which on account of its enormous size he called the shield of Minerva, defender of the city. In this, he mingled the livers of pike, the brains of pheasants and peacocks, the tongues of flamingos, and the meat of lampreys, brought by his captains and 3 rams from the whole empire, from Parthia to the Spanish Strait. So from the extreme east to the extreme west. Everything that could be found in the empire was brought to Vitellius's table. And by the way, this is not the real Vitellius. This is a famous bust from the Louvre, which is called usually pseudo Vitellius. The real Vitellius is seen on this coin, and he looked like this. He was also not very thin, but at least his nose was quite different. Now we come to the idea of the vomitoria, because we hear quite often that the Romans used to eat a lot, and when they were full, they went to a special place called the vomitorium, where you could vomit up everything you ate, and then return and eat again. And there are some remarks in ancient writers, like the one that you heard about Vitellius and another one about Caesar. But Caesar was very ascetic. He never gorged on food. If he did that for medical purposes, and that was not a common practice. The actual vomitoria existed in Rome, but they were not related to anything connected to food. They were passages in the theaters, for example, and that is what they looked like. So that's like a thin passage outside, and that's why they were called like that. And in the French language, this word is still used. An important feature of a Roman feast was the division of food and drink. Alcohol consumption only began when the eating as such was over. It was also a subject of a separate ritual. And this approach helped distinguish between the calm and solemn dinner on the one hand and the riotous drinking party on the other. But also, no one started drinking before they were full, which is important for countering alcoholism as such, because, you know, in northern countries, in Russia, in some of the Scandinavian countries, the worst examples of alcohol consumption is when people drink before they eat something or without eating anything. So being drunk was criticized, though it was quite common. If a guest was unable at the end of the drinking party to go home on his own, a special supporting slave was furnished for him. The total duration of the dinner and drinking party was limited by the working schedule of those having a feast, but remember the Roman calendar, there were lots of holidays or days inauspicious for work, or something of the kind. And for that reason, the Romans often could stay and drink into the small hours. The entwinement of the ideas of eating and dining is typical of any culture, but in Rome, their affinity was especially striking. Dinner halls, called triclinia, from three couches, I'll come back to that a little bit later, were often decorated with mosaics and frescoes depicting skeletons, skulls, and other postmodern features. The skulls are often laughing, though, and the skeletons might carry huge jars of wine in their bony hands. This recent find in Antioch, a town which is now called Antakya near the Turkish-Syrian border, is called the Reckless Skeleton. The text, in Greek, says, "Be cheerful, enjoy your life." And this is the scene from the archaeological dig. This mosaic represents a specific Roman genre, which was very typical of dining rooms. It is called, again with a Greek word, asaroton, which means unswept floor. It represents an optical illusion of the leftovers from a feast on the floor of a rich house. That was apparently the typical way of dealing with leftovers. They were simply tossed onto the floor and swept away sometime later when the dinner was over. This mosaic is easily found online, but it's hard to find any information about it. Apparently, it is in a private collection. It can't be seen in any museum, and it dates to about 3rd century AD. Whether the floor here is just littered with food or decorated with asaroton, or both, it's impossible to say. Note, by the way, the water or wine distributing device in the lower right angle of the picture. That might be the famous autepsa, which is basically the Roman samovar, the Russian tea drinking device. And this type of device was known since the ancient Roman times. It's even mentioned in one of Cicero's letters. What we know about ancient Roman food, we know from a cookbook. And by the way, it is the first ever ancient cookbook to have reached us. We don't have, for example, an ancient Egyptian cookbook or even an ancient Greek one. So we're left with scant literary evidence and our more or less educated guesses. The book is usually called by the name of the supposed author, Apicius, or Apicius. And this Marcus Gavius Apicius is believed to have been a Roman gourmet and lover of luxury who lived sometime in the 1st century AD during the reign of Tiberius. However, the book, which has many different names, here for instance it's called De Arte Coquinaria, it's also called De Re Coquinaria, so about cooking stuff, about cooking things. The book was written much later, though it is not clear exactly when. And it was written in a language that is closer to vulgar Latin and not to classical, literary, high-educated Latin. The text is organized in 10 books with Greek titles, even though it is written in Latin. And the titles are such as The Careful Housekeeper, The Meat Mincer, The Gardener, Many Ingredients, Pulse, and so on. So it's very similar to Mrs. Beeton, for example, to later cookbooks of all kinds of eras. Right, so what do we do if we want to organize a Roman feast? Quite often, when it happens, it looks more or less like that, with everyone sitting at a table, drinking from plastic cups and eating, for crying out loud, bananas. Bananas are native more or less to Indonesia and Iraq. However, if you want to show something more historically accurate, and with a budget that is slightly larger than that of an average junior school, the result is usually also very far from perfect. Here, for example, an excellent TV series, Rome, and in this scene you see how they depict a typical Roman banquet feast, even though this is a small affair here, but it would be the same if it were a large feast. Or this is not one of the usual modern mistakes, like in the last century they knew everything perfectly well. They did not. This is the picture by Roberto Bompiani of around 1887. So as you can see, in the later 19th century, the idea was more or less the same. I do not mean to say that chairs, for instance, did not exist in ancient Rome. They did, and this is one of the versions of what they looked like. However, the function of chairs was different. Unless you were a decrepit old man, you never used a chair for food-related purposes. You used a chair for situations like this. If you were an emperor or some other type of high official, a chair was your standard place where you were listening to your subordinates and receiving gifts of praise or something of the kind. Now, a typical Roman dining space was called a triclinium, from Greek words for three and kline, a couch or something like a chaiselong. When we see something like that, our guess would typically be that a person was lying on the kline with his or her body parallel to the length of the couch. So the arrangement was a dining space for three people, right? Wrong. Because each kline was a place for three people, and they were not lying parallel to the table, even though the table was small and round, and you can't really put anything parallel to a small round table. It was quite possible to have fewer people on one couch, but never more than three, right? So there could be fewer than 9 people, but not more than 9 people at one table. The couches in this arrangement were divided into 3 categories, as shown on this diagram: blue for hosts, green for high-status guests, and black for low-status guests. And note that the low-status couch is called lectus summus, the upper couch, and perhaps it was supposed to be less offensive that way. As you can see, one of the sides remained open, and it was necessary for placing dishes on the table and removing them. Even if it was okay to throw leftovers onto the floor, the dishes and such still had to be moved around. That way, a servant or a slave could approach the table from this accessible side. So it looked more or less like this, and these couches were rather wide because you had to place your whole body diagonally on that couch. One more thing. If it was a huge feast, then there were many triclinia all around a huge dining hall, for example. And during some of the emperor's feast, apparently it was more or less like that. Not a lot of people around the dining table, not a huge table like in the Middle Ages, where all around the guests were sitting and the king was sitting at the head of the table and so on, but rather a huge number of triclinia located and put inside the dining hall. The famous historian Suetonius, who wrote that famous collection of historical biographies, which I had already quoted from, known as De Vita Caesarum, or the 12 Caesars, also wrote a series of short bios of various poets, including one about the famous comedy writer Terence. I quote, "He wrote 6 comedies, and when he offered the first of these, the Andria, to the aediles," that's public officials responsible for the maintenance of buildings and regulations of festivals, they bade him first read it to Caecilius. Having come to the poet's house when he was dining, and being meanly clad, Terence is said to have read the beginning of the play sitting on a bench near the great man's couch. So, see, sitting on a bench near the great man's couch in a kind of a subordinate position. But after a few lines, he was invited to take his place at the table, right? His place at the table is not on a bench. And after dining with Caecilius, he ran through the rest to his host's great admiration. So the host was listening, and then he liked it, and then he invited him to dine with him, and then he listened to the whole poem. This position at the table, replete with status, was so important that people were often depicted like that on their tombstones. Like on this one. This is one Flavius Agricola from the 2nd century AD, obviously somewhat post-classical times, because roughly before the times of Hadrian, high-status Romans never wore a beard. And here we can see a man with a beard. That means that it's after Hadrian or around. This sculpture is currently in a museum in Indianapolis in the United States. This fresco from Pompeii, painted in the so-called fourth style and has apparently not a very long time before the eruption, shows the final stages of the banquet, which was sometimes called symposion, from sympinein, to drink together, again, Greek. Today's word symposium is basically the same. We can see that one of the guests, the one in the lower right corner, is not feeling very well and has to be supported by a slave. The slaves are depicted as small. This might be an indication of their status, or it might mean that they were young boys. There is a number of graffiti on the fresco dating back to Roman times. One of them is Bibo, I drink. Another is Valedis, be healthy. That's a standard greeting, basically. And then there is also a very interesting graffiti which says Schio, I know, and it's written about the couple on the left. So the author of that graffiti, and probably of the whole fresco, says that he, most probably it's a he, knows something about that couple on the left. Another fragment from Suetonius, from the biography of Caligula. He was no whit more respectful or mild towards the Senate, allowing some who had held the highest offices to run in their togas for several miles beside his chariot and to wait on him at table, standing napkin in hand, either at the head of his couch or at his feet. So these high status people, the senators, were waiting at Caligula at his table. This does not mean to say that eating and drinking while seated was unheard of in Roman times. That's certainly not true. Even eating while standing was quite common, especially during the day. Another Pompeii painting shows a situation like that in a tavern. But again, we have to keep in mind that the idea of catering was a lower class phenomenon for the Romans. So higher status Romans ate at home. This is the painting called The Wine Shop by Lawrence Alma-Tadema, the famous Prephiolite British painter, and it dates from about the late 1860s or early 1870s. Here is another example of the taverna life from another Pompeian fresco. It's from the so-called Inn of Salvius in Pompeii, and it's a part of a whole kind of a comic strip series of paintings. The man on the left calls to the barmaid, "Over here," he says, "hoc," while the man on the right says, "No, it's mine, non mia est." The barmaid, carrying a cup and wine jug, says, "The man who ordered this will get it. Oceanus, come here and drink. We vol sumat oceane veni bibe." The famous Isidore of Seville, often regarded as the last scholar of the ancient world and currently considered by the Vatican to be the patron saint of the internet, wrote in his encyclopedic work called Etymologiae that the benches for dining are called sedes from the verb sedere, to sit, And that strikes him as illogical, because why status if the people who actually dine, they recline, they're lying, not sitting there. He also knows that in old times, women used to sit, right, as low status beings, and now they recline too, and this is a sure sign of moral decline. Plutarch, writing about those various habits and everything, uh, mentions in his life of Augustus that Mark Antony, reproaching Augustus, recalls that he was eager to marry Livia, which was his wife, and then for many decades she remained his wife, and that he took a consular wife, so she was married to a consul, somebody else, right in front of her husband's eyes to his bedchamber, and then brought her back, disheveled and red from head to toe. But that means that the consul wife was dining together with the consul and Augustus and everyone else. So it was a joint, non-sexually segregated kind of a feast, kind of a dinner. So the concluding section of my presentation is an attempt to offer you some cooking skills in the ancient Roman style. It's called Cato's Cakes, and the recipe is taken from the treatise by Cato the Elder, which is called De Agricultura, on agriculture. Cato the Elder was a famous soldier, senator, and historian who was staunchly pro-Roman, and he tried, historically speaking, unsuccessfully, to resist the Hellenization of Roman life, even though he was quite well versed in all things Greek and spoke Greek fluently. He tried to stop the bilingualism of the upper classes and so on. But by the classical times, by the times of the Caesars, the Roman elite was indeed bilingual. So the flour, which is one part of the recipe and which you should use here, it has to be of the highest quality, and preferably it should be produced from spelt. Spelt is a hexaploid wheat, which means that it has 6 sets of chromosomes. Well, the Romans didn't know that, but they knew that spelt was special. The other thing is the cheese. It's very difficult to find a cheese that would be similar to the original Roman thing. We just don't know enough. In this case, it should certainly be a soft type of cheese, and probably ricotta is about the best option. So the recipe goes as follows. You mix up semolina flour and ricotta, and the ratio, judging by the volume, is more or less 1-to-1. 1 part of ricotta, 1 part of flour. You make small balls from this mixture. You pour some olive oil into a deep pan and wait until it's very, very hot. Then you fry the balls in the oil until they become golden, like in this picture. Then you drain off the excess oil on some cooking paper or something. Then you cover the balls with a layer of honey. It's okay to heat honey in a microwave a little bit, because otherwise it doesn't pour as readily. And then you sprinkle some poppy seeds all over them, and that's it. That's Cato's well, I would say Cato's balls, but it doesn't sound very nice. That's Cato's dessert. It has a very peculiar taste. It doesn't taste as anything very familiar, but it's not extremely exotic or strange either, and it's quite palatable. So I round up my presentation with a quote from the famous Roman author Seneca. Enjoy your present pleasures so as not to endure those which are to follow. And we'll hope in those coronavirus days that we still have many days to follow, which will not be as dismal as these ones. Thank you very much. I conclude here. I will now try to switch on the chat feature, and I will be happy to answer any questions you might have. Just a second while I try to do that. Okay. Did the Last Supper take place in some kind of triclinium? Last Supper was happening somewhere around Jerusalem. And I think that the eating habits of the Jews at the time were quite different from those of the Romans. So probably not. The Roman veneer over Jewish life at the moment was very thin. So I don't think that it was that pervasive. In other provinces, quite probably, but not in Judea. Did Romans mix wine with water like Greeks? And who and when ate sacrificed animals? And there was some kind of, the Romans mixed wine with water like Greeks. And the habit of drinking undiluted wine was a barbaric habit. So they knew that quite well. And who and when ate sacrificed animals? Well, I think I'm afraid to make a mistake here, but I think that after a sacrifice, after some kind of rite, it was a custom to hand out the pieces of meat and so on to the attendees. And if there was some sort of feast, it probably took place around the temple, because the temple was not a place where you went to worship your gods. The temple was usually, for ancient Romans and Greeks, the place where the gods live. That was quite important there. But other than that, I think that it was happening something like this, like a huge popular feast. Was there a concept of working week during Roman times? No, there was no Saturday or Sunday, but as you see, there were lots and lots of festive and non-working days. So the Romans were not overworked. They didn't have to work like 360 days per year. They had many stretches of non-working days. Right. How Roman diet influenced their health? Well, it's really very hard to say, because we can't actually study the Romans on our CT machines and take their blood and examine their health in a variety of other ways. So it's rather hard to say. But the Romans who survived their infant years usually, and who survived the vagaries of the wars or famines or repressions or anything else that was violent, they could live to quite a ripe old age. So I assume that basically the Roman diet was not that bad. Have you watched an episode of British TV show, These Supersizers Eat, about ancient Rome? They actually had a dormer. I didn't, and I'm afraid that many British depictions of the kind veer towards some historical mistakes. For example, I have a book by a famous British cook about ancient cuisine, and parts of this book are quite interesting, but parts are quite clearly mistaken. He didn't read up well enough on Roman cooking, so you have to treat that with a, so to say, with a grain of salt. Few words about street food culture, please. Well, street food culture was quite popular in Pompeii, for example, because when you look at the plan of the archaeological digs in Pompeii, and when you walk the streets of Pompeii, you see lots and lots of what is called tabernae, of taverns, of small cafes, of places where you could actually eat and drink. So there were many options of taking something small there, or maybe grabbing something and then going out and eating. But once again, during the day, that was quite normal, even for high status Romans, because they did not eat a lot during the day. Do we nowadays have wine styles that have their origin in Roman times? No, unfortunately not, because we don't really know a lot about the type of the drink the ancient Greek and Roman wine was. We can guess at some of the varieties which were known in antiquity, but these are just guesses, not more. Did Romans use much salt and vinegar and something to preserve food for stock or for winter? Well, yes. The Romans did use salt. They used salt quite well, and actually one of the reasons why the city of Rome appeared where it did appear was that it was the cross-section of some trading routes of very ancient, very old antiquity, and one of these directions was the one where ancient people were digging salt and using that for various cooking purposes, or maybe preserving purposes. So yes, preserves made with food was quite known, and vinegar was also known. So these types of preservatives were well known for the Romans. And Apicius, I think, at least some of the recipes where you could actually use some kind of pickled things. So it was not an impossible things for Romans. Well, if you have more questions, you are welcome to go to my Facebook page and to leave your questions there. Did they have onions? Yes, they did have onions. Were there eating rooms in Roman baths? No, I don't think so. I think that baths were the places which were supposed to be very much health-oriented and not oriented towards eating or drinking. So they were rooms for physical exercise, yes, but not for eating. Well, thank you very much, and I do hope to see you again. Those of you who understand Russian are very welcome to come to my other lectures in Russian. I will be giving one rather soon. I'm not quite sure when exactly, but within more or less a week's time. And it will be well, somebody says that it's hard to ask you via Facebook because you have no permission. That can't be true. I don't have any kind of restriction on my Facebook page, so anyone on Facebook can ask me there, and it's not for friends, it's not for anyone, so it's not restricted. Yeah, my next Russian language lecture will be, I think, about the Tunguska meteorite. It's one of the major catastrophic events of the 20th century. It happened in 1908, and it was a huge catastrophe, which apparently didn't kill anyone, or at least if it did, there were just a few people, because it happened in the remote woods of Siberia. But it's interesting for a variety of reasons. One of them is because nobody actually knows what it was. And there are lots of various hypotheses ranging from the more scientific to the more bizarre. So I will try to say a few words about that. Thank you very much. And I will be very happy to see you again. And I hope that I will read another lecture in English at some point in the near future. Thank you and bye-bye.